of the Edge Conference. This session is Art and Industry. We've got two papers, one from Jack MacGregor Reid and one from Lindsay Blair following. So what we're going to do is go through both papers. Lindsay's got a short film to show at the end of her paper, and then we'll go straight into questions covering both. So Jack today is going to, his paper's titled, oh, do you know, my dogs just know when I'm on, don't they? I think they sit and wait. Anyway, Jack's paper is Theatrical Responses to the Arctic, a post-Soviet Arctic story. And I'm really delighted that Jack is presenting this afternoon. He is a drama and performance graduate. He recently completed the first UHI MRes thesis, for which he wrote, it was the MRes Creative Practice, and he wrote a stage play for that. He's now an associate artist with Dogstar Theatre and is actually going to be in Glasgow doing casting, doing auditions for his new play, which will be staged with Dogstar later on in the year. So he makes films, he makes stage plays, and we're very proud of Jack, actually, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what he's got to say about his creative process, in particular his post-Soviet Arctic story. So Jack, you just start whenever you're ready.
Thanks very much, Lesley. That was a very, very kind and generous introduction. I'm just going to start now by just doing an audio check. Thumbs up if I sound okay. Just, yep, sound okay? Okay, good. And I'm going to share my screen. And is that all right? Sharing fine? Okay. So at any point, because I'm in the thing, if anyone wants to stop me, you just get on the microphone and tell me something's wrong, okay? So thanks everybody for being here. It's a great honor to present today at the Edge Conference. I know this has been a long time coming, and I wish I could see you all in person, but this has still been really cool. In particular, I'd like to thank Jo for her hard work on this conference, because I've known her for like 2 years and she's been working on this for about 2 years. It means a lot to speak here today about my research, which has changed so much since I wrote the paper proposal about a year or over a year ago. But this presentation still has its original purpose, which is to introduce the central location of my research, the play that was created in response to the Soviet Arctic, and how I as an artist respond to that landscape and that culture. So first, we'll start by talking a little bit about me. I'm a writer, I'm a director of film and theater. I graduated with the MRes in Creative Practice, as Lesley was saying, completing the project that I'm talking to you today about. This MRes was supervised by Dr. Lesley Mickle of the Department of Drama, Dr. Andrew Jennings from Northern Studies, and Matthew Zajac, the artistic director of Dogstar Theatre Company. So I love research, and it's the cornerstone of my practice as an artist. And for the past 2 years, I've been very much into the Arctic as a space for research and drama. This is a photograph here taken of me at the end of 2019. That's me in Barentsburg, which is the last Russian settlement on the Svalbard archipelago. So before we crack on any further, I wanted to just hawk some of my recent examples of work. Up there is Amnesty, which is a solo show I developed for COP26 in Glasgow, exploring complex moral questions about climate justice. And below that is Hedda Gabler, which I developed prior to the lockdown in March 2020. And it was developed as a response to urban paranoia and police states in the 21st century. But since lockdown, a lot of my work has been focused on film because theaters couldn't exist for a long time. So I did an awful lot of digital work, short films, using young people with actors, actors I know locally, fantastic, talented people that just are trying to get ahead in the industry, just like myself. And we talk about inequality and austerity, and we respond to the crisis that art is really good at engaging with. Most of my work is made very quickly. We've got a quick turnaround, and it's designed to be accessible. So that usually means it's online and it's free. But we're not here to talk about that. We're talking about my research in the Arctic. So we'll start by looking at Svalbard. Svalbard as the edge, because it does lie at the edge of northern human habitation. It was first discovered by the Dutch in 1596, although Russia contests this claim and say that it was discovered by the Pomors, which is a distinct ethnic subculture in northwestern Russia or Karelia today. But this is disputed, and I've just said, just to be safe, it was discovered by the Dutch in 1596. Regardless, it remained as unclaimed land and unclaimed territory until the 20th century. To give you the extremely quick overview of Svalbard's recent history, in the early part of the 20th century, there was a coal mining boom that made Svalbard extremely attractive to industrialists from across the world. And all of this international attention culminated in the 1920 Spitsbergen Treaty, which I believe, as far as I can tell from my research, is perhaps the only or one of the only treaties from the Paris Peace Conference post World War I that is still upheld in its entirety today. So the treaty said that the islands of Svalbard, the archipelago, was to be awarded to Norway on the condition that other countries there could settle the islands for scientific and industrial purposes. And this is how we end up with a place like Svalbard, which is under the control of Norway, but operates as an international demilitarized treaty territory in the highly contested Arctic Ocean. So to capitalize on this mining boom, the Soviet Union was one of the first countries to take advantage of this treaty and purchase several mining outposts in Svalbard. They were Grumant, Barentsborg, and Pyramiden. And you can see here from the map the Svalbard's relative location to the European continent. So Pyramiden is the sort of centerpiece of my research, and it's one of the 3 towns that the USSR operated, that they bought from other countries, took over, and then developed themselves. And they were coal mining settlements, and Pyramiden is the furthest north of these, and it was once the world's farthest north permanent civilian settlement, and was acquired by the USSR in 1927 from the Swedish. It was developed over the next 2 decades into a model town that was unique because it was exposed to the west through Norway, placed within the territory of a NATO member state. The chance to live in Pyramiden was highly controlled and was seen as a great honor for Soviet citizens to live in this really, really remote community at the far, far north of Svalbard. And it was an honor that was only given to the best miners in the Soviet Union, from Tula in modern-day Russia and Donbass in modern Ukraine, so coal-rich, industry-rich regions of the USSR. And they made up the bulk of the workforce in this mining outpost. At its peak, over 1,000 workers and their families lived here in Pyramiden. But in 1998, it was abandoned and all its residents left. We'll come back to why this happened in a minute, but it is important to emphasize that Pyramiden was a fully functional town. It was in many ways self-sufficient, in many ways even eco-friendly in the way it operated, although they didn't mean for this to be the case. It was a pragmatic, authentic community that was, in its heyday, prosperous. The settlement has a sports complex, a cinema, a swimming pool, a school, a daycare, multiple apartments for single workers and their families, 2 dom culturi or cultural houses, a cafeteria, an indoor farm, and of course, a big sign. Pyramiden is owned by Trust Arctic Gogol, or the Arctic Coal Trust, a Russian state-owned company that survives today as part of the Russian Federation. So it's a state-owned company that goes through the USSR system and survives today as part of the Federation. And its stated goal is to supply the northern cities of the Soviet Union, now Russian Federation, with coal. But now just owns the land and property of Pyramiden as an abandoned settlement. So what changed? Why did Pyramiden, such a prosperous, shining example of Soviet socialism in action, why did it collapse? Why did everybody leave? Well, when the USSR fell apart in the early 90s, there was a sharp economic contraction, and the Russian Federation, the successor state to the USSR, could not maintain its large Arctic presence. There was in 1996 a plane crash that killed many of the Russian workers in the Svalbard colonies. And this blow of loss of expertise and also loss of morale, coupled with the devastating cuts, led to the settlement being closed in 1998. And this left only Barentsburg in the south of Svalbard with its small population of around 500 ethnic Russians and Ukrainians. Grumant, on the other hand, was so unprofitable that it had been closed in the 1960s. It's important to remember that none of these settlements in Svalbard made any money for the USSR or the Russian Federation. They were entirely unprofitable, which begs the question as to why they were kept open for so long. Well, a lot of it can be the propaganda purposes of the model town, but I sort of have my own theories about why they would keep it open in the territory of a NATO member. And I think it goes beyond things like soft power. But since 2007, the Russian government has reopened much of Pyramiden for tours and tourism in general, with guides with rifles who look after these structures and keep out local wildlife like polar bears, who outnumber humans on Svalbard. If you're ever in Svalbard and you're walking around, you'll notice a lot of people are carrying guns because you've got to have a gun with you if you ever leave the settlements. And Pyramiden isn't classified as a settlement anymore, so you have to carry a gun when you're out there walking. So this place, its history, and this ruin in particular has inspired the creation of a new stage play, which I've called Nightlands. Over the course of 2020 and 2021, I wrote this play with the collaboration of my supervisors and with Matthew Zajac and his company. And it's set in the distant past of 1999, and it follows two characters. One character is called Slava, and Slava is a Russian woman who comes of age in the 1990s during that turbulent period of economic decline that is associated with the Boris Yeltsin presidency. She is shaped by the failed promise of the democratic state of Russia with its neoliberal reforms. In many ways, she is symbolic of a lost generation that grew up in a country very different from her parents and her grandparents. And then she is joined by the second character of this two-hander, Sasha, who is a Ukrainian man in his late 50s, early 60s, and he's a child of the Great Patriotic War, a devout Marxist-Leninist. And he lives with a bitter life of loyalty to that bygone USSR system. So both of these characters are living in a self-imposed exile in Svalbard, looking after the settlement while no one else is there. They are strangers from their homeland, economically and spiritually. So these two characters with their opposing worldviews, one of the Federation and one of the USSR, is what Svetlana Alexievich called the twin parts of the Russian Soviet soul, a conflict of nostalgia that defines contemporary Russian culture and politics. These two worldviews that look ahead to the future and back to the past form the basis of modern Russia's dilemma and how its leaders imagine its place in the world. It was this interesting conflict, this restorative nostalgia, that gave and continues to sustain the legitimacy of President Vladimir Putin, who came to power in 1999, the year in which the play is set. And so you can see that the two characters represent the two parts of that Russian Soviet soul and the conflict that happens within. Pyramiden is the Federation in microcosm, a diminished state living within the ruins of another. Nostalgia is at the core of this play and how it twists our sense of self and past. As Svetlana Boym writes, the fantasies of the past, determined by the needs of the present, have a direct impact on the realities of the future. Nostalgia itself has a utopian dimension. So we're dealing in imagination and we're dealing in fantasy, sure. But in our present time, when East and West relations are defined by their mutual incomprehension of one another, I thought it was really important to write a play that didn't rely on the generalization of Russia or the East in general by fetishizing the trappings of imperialism. Because as Jamie Rand points out, by fetishizing those trappings of imperialism, Western observers will help perpetuate it. A serious interrogation of modern Russian identity and Russian politics should challenge the continuation of harmful Cold War narratives into the 21st century. And so Nightlands as a play instead chooses to reflect the confused political paranoia and general apathy that allows Vladimir Putin to take control of the Russian Federation. It is a play set in the final weeks of Boris Yeltsin's presidency, as Russia was sliding into a leaderless form of oligarchy, what journalist David Remnick calls the mafia state. And so the shadow of Vladimir Putin looms over the action. He is never named in the script, but his presence is felt all the same. And that is what this play really is about. It's about this place at the edge of habitable civilization, and you have this conflict that really is about a country and the erosion of democracy. So not only does Nightlands comment on the allure of populism and populist strongmen, it seeks to speak about a shared desire felt across society for national renewal. Both of the characters agree that there should be some kind of better future for Russia, for Ukraine, for the East in general, that things are bad currently, but they can never decide on how to fix the situation. Sasha trusts the old ideas rooted in the communist dictatorship, while the younger Slava dreams of a neoliberal global Svalbardian village where globalization brings emancipation, a future where identity and borders and conflict will recede into memory. But we know now, post 9/11, post financial crisis, post Arab Spring, that these ideas from the 1990s, these end of history ideas, are not workable solutions, and that the real pressures and current pressures of austerity politics or capitalism in general, what Mark Fisher called post capitalist desire, the desire to escape the pain of the present system, yet we are unable to articulate that alternative world in a satisfying way. And that is the conflict at the heart of this text. The play embraces a unique relationship with the truth. The characters themselves are unreliable narrators. There is a confusion that happens as the polar night sets in and the scenes begin to blend together. The characters are in constant darkness. Post-truth emerges within the text, and that is reflective of the very top of Russian society. As Luke Harding comments, the goal of Putin's Russia, that is to say, modern Russia, is to confuse the public and to spread the idea that the truth really is unknowable, that it is a form of epistemological warfare. And that, I think, is the terrible truth of the intergenerational conflict within Russia and in other countries across the world, that a system that escapes truth can never have a transformation or real change towards progress, that a society can become stuck in time, a pattern of thinking that will in turn create political stagnation, a rot from the top down of a society. And so this story about Russia and this small outpost and the Arctic Circle is actually really about all of us. It speaks to us in the West and is a warning against the erosion of democratic institutions in the face of corruption and in the face of a culture of austerity. Most importantly, Nightlands is a product of Pyramidon. It is a warning that your own sense of self, your own sense of nation and identity is actually very fragile and rests on shaky fictions. And even when these fictions are in meltdown, we cling to dead things, to ruins and ideas, long after they have faded from the present world. In her book, Witness on Stage, dramatist Molly Flynn addresses the cataclysmic cultural changes that were created by the fall of the USSR in 1991. Quote, as the fault lines of Eastern European cultural memory continue to lead to violence and conflict in Russia and other former Soviet countries, it has become increasingly vital for artists and academics to do the difficult work of reprocessing the socialist past and present. It is the significance of Soviet history remains of crucial consequence throughout the region and the rest of the world. End quote. This inflection point in history is the root of current conflict in Ukraine, in Belarus, in the Baltic, in the Caucasus, in Armenia and Azerbaijan. One can look at the same event and see something very different from another person, and all of this is contained in a beautifully preserved ruin on the cold edge of the Arctic. Finally, I would like to end by saying that this play has been funded by Creative Scotland and will be touring in 2022 with Dogstar Theatre Company. and I'm also very pleased to be attached to this project as both writer and director. You can follow Dogstar Theatre Company for more information in the following weeks using these social media things. But it is a great honor to see that and to see my work getting made like that. It feels awesome. It's so good. So thank you for listening to this presentation. I hope I haven't taken up too much of your time. As you can see, this is what I've been really obsessed with for a few years now, this idea of adapting the Soviet Arctic as a space for drama. And if there's time at the end, I would love to take some of your questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Jack. That was fantastic, and yeah, so excited, so exciting about the play, so exciting that the MRes creative practice has developed in this way, and yeah. So I'm delighted to introduce Lindsay Blair, who will be talking about the ringnet on the edge, Angus Martin poet and Will Maclean artist. So Lindsay is a reader in visual culture and theory at UHI, and she's interested in codes of representation, and her early research was on the American artist Joseph Cornell. She is recognised as really quite an authority on Cornell. Her monograph on Cornell has been reprinted many times. She's had a BBC omnibus documentary on Cornell screened in '91, and as well as her film on Susan Sontag in 2003. She's a principal investigator for the European network, Hands Across the Sea, and she's part of the CSEA EU project and the Arctic Sustainable Arts and Design Network. She's an invited expert for national review panels on several European journals, and has many outputs, including Mutations from Below, Land Raiders of Reef, and I'm not going to say this correctly, I'm sorry, Lindsay, and Swielichen, I don't know. Yes, so I'm going to stop wittering actually and let Lindsay just start her talk, because I'm really looking forward to it. So thank you, Lindsay. You just start whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much, Lesley. Thank you for the lovely introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. Fresca. I wonder, can everyone see the PowerPoint? Can somebody let me know? Can somebody say?
Yes, Lindsay, we can see that.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to talk to you today. Subject of my talk today will be the text-image collaboration between poet and historian Angus Martin and the artist Will Maclean. Their research, carried out in the 1970s, was on the subject of the ringnet herring fishing. This was a method of fishing which began in Loch Fyne in the 1840s, and from there extended northwards to the Minches and then to the east coast edge of Scotland's coastline. By the late 1970s, it was all but finished. The ringnet was a method of inshore fishing. It was developed and designed in relation to the coastline of Kintyre, where the boats would fish at night in pairs, with the crews often camping on the shores within easy access of their fishing grounds. And so we can see one edge of this paper as essentially geophysical, and the other edge is formal or conceptual. The collaboration between Martin and Maclean in the far-reaching exhibition of the ringnet in 1978 was groundbreaking in the way that it combined not just industry and art, but also word and image. The fact that this multimedia exhibition was mounted at the Contemporary Art Space of the Third Eye Centre in Glasgow was a radical response to the long-held assumption that art and industry were in separate categories. The fact that word, and oftentimes the words of the fishermen themselves, and images were given equal significance in the exhibition was a radical questioning of the conventional edge between word and image. To return to the beginning of the Maclean-Martin collaboration research, which I mentioned was in the early 1970s, Maclean contacted Martin to see if he could provide him with any information on the ringnet fishing in Campbelltown. The first collaboration was to last several years up until the exhibition, The Ringnet, when it opened, as I mentioned, at the Third Eye Centre in Glasgow, and it toured to several other venues. You see here the flyer from the DeMarco Gallery. And this was nominally Maclean's exhibition. Martin's book, The Ringnet Fisherman, which you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, came out in 1981. But both productions came out of the collaborations between these two researchers. I should contend that out of the comprehensive research that they carried out into the ringnet, Maclean and Martin have achieved something of a multi-dimensional reality. The ringnet is a collection of drawings, photographs, printed plans, diagrams and models, numbering more than 340 items. The whole installation was bought by the Gallery of Modern Art in Edinburgh in 1979, and Maclean and Martin have collaborated on a number of projects since that time. The ringnet, its history, imagery, its lore, continue to reverberate in the works of both men. I want to look at a few images of the ring netting to show the kind of presence that the ringnet herring industry had in Kintyre. These images you're seeing here are by A.B. Ovenston from the 1880s, when the ringnet industry was flourishing. And this is a photograph by Maclean himself from the 1960s, by which time the industry was in decline. As I mentioned, the ringnet project set out to cover the entire history of ringnetting from the 1840s to its residual state in the late 1970s. It was concerned not just with the fishermen and their methods of fishing, but other associated industries: boat building, engineering, sail making, net making, curing, gutting, and packing. These are three images from the exhibition. Maclean and Martin had both worked as fishermen at the ringnet. In fact, Martin was still working aboard a fishing boat during their research period, and this shared background undoubtedly contributed immeasurably to the effectiveness of the collaboration. They set about the enterprise with an absolute conviction that they could convey to the public something of the multi-dimensional reality of the industry. The very notion that such an aspiration should underlie what is in essence an oral history project reveals the radical nature of the whole enterprise. That something such as a subsection of the fishing industry on the west coast of Scotland could embody some of the most distinctive and resonant elements of a culture is little short of heresy. In his preface to Billy Kay's Odyssey programme of the 1980s, which included one on the ringnet fishermen, Owen Dudley Edwards writes, "It is not from oral history that we get blood. Otherwise, all that remains to us are it is from oral history that we get blood. Otherwise, all that remains to us are dry bones. It is not simply a question of reality, but of multi-dimensional reality, being provided by the evidence of those who heard, saw, and felt the historical experience with which we are concerned. It is chapters of Scottish social history. It is the backgrounds of folk art and song. It is human drama and the wellsprings of literature. It is, in the last analysis, all of us." I spoke in an earlier presentation this year about Michael Gardner's thesis in from Truckee to Trainspotting. And I want to just expand on one or two ideas here. Gardiner's insightful reading of Scottish culture has several strands, but central to it is the notion of the need for resistance to hegemonic powers, which assert a narrow ascendant canon. The key term for the survival of Scottish literature, according to Gardiner, is genre. Gardiner insists that it is through imaginative and diverse ways of organising texts that Scottish culture can resist the ascendant canon. Only by increased flexibility in the rethinking of typologies can Scottish literature radically assert its own independent cultural integrity. While there is much to admire in Gardiner's thesis, he has a limited interest in oral culture. The notion of the folk has only 2 references in his whole thesis. And whilst he makes a positive nod in the direction of Hamish Henderson, he clearly regards the question of oral history as marginal to serious cultural inquiry. There is no sense in which his thesis supports the assertion by Billy Kay at the conclusion to his Odyssey series when he describes oral history as, quote, the spectre which haunts the corridors of the academy. The complexity of research on the ringnet from a number of perspectives is revealed over and over again in the correspondence between Maclean and Martin. The plethora of information that was collected during the investigation required a system or structure. This was achieved by approaching it in sections. There was a section which dealt with boat designs, for example, or with a variety of ringnet practices, or the use of different types of brailers, or the development of winch designs, or the move from sail to motor power. No detail was seen to be too small, though, as the correspondence between Maclean and Martin indicate. You see a quote here from their letters: nothing must escape us, from the makers' names of the stove and the cooking pot to the brand of tobacco that the men used in their pipes, were they clay or briar pipes? Did they have all the little metal lids that my grandfather had, even as an old man? So this brings us to the central element of this paper, that is word and image. Martin's information was gained primarily by tape recording interviews with retired fishermen, and these interviews were to form the basis of his book, which I had mentioned earlier, The Ringnet Fisherman from 1981. So here are the fishermen.
We were in the Kyles one night, the Kyles of Bute, and we're lying a lovely moonlight night. And I was in a boat they called the Glad Tidings. We felt just like a spittle in the water, like a spittle. And just to pass the time, we thought we'd just have a go, get a wee bit of work, because we've nothing doing it. And we shot, and we got the full of the night. We had to get help. We had to get another pair alongside. And funny enough, we're in 2 pair. And company, the 2 pair was in company. Another pair of boats, our own pair of boats was away up, and it was them that came to give us a hand. And we nearly filled the 4 boats with one spittle. It was that calm. It was dead calm, not a dead one. If they're herring about, we could see them like bubbling, just small bubbles coming to the surface. We called that putting up. The Tarbert fishermen, they called that the frying.
The voices of the fishermen and their dependence on their senses add such a strong element of the phenomenological to the whole project. The transcripts also provided Maclean with the raw materials for his drawings, but he would often have additional lists of questions and requests for sketches by the fishermen informants.
We were in the cave.
Or from Martin himself to ensure that as accurate a representation as possible could be accomplished. Many of Maclean's letters testify to his anxiety regarding the documentary element of his drawings. Here is one of his letters asking for clarity about developments in the deck design of ringnet boats at different periods. And despite all of these difficulties, Maclean stated in a letter, quote, "I never cease to be amazed by the amount of information that a drawing can contain when it's combined with some writing." So the following sketch of a forecastle showing the sleeping quarters for the fishermen on a very early herring skiff is a good example of how they work together on word and image. So alongside the multitude of drawings, alongside the actual objects such as net needles and buoys and the models and the taped conversations with the fishermen, are all the plans, designs of boats and gear from boatyards and factories. Each of these very different elements convey the same sort of objective, the pursuit of the indexical link to a source, rather than either a symbolic relationship in descriptive, quote, professional language, or an iconic one, such as a sketch or artistic impression. One of the points to be noticed is that this research was the fact that Maclean and Martin would often check published source materials against the memoirs, the memories, logbooks, diaries of fishermen who knew the field often better than those who would have been regarded as the experts. I mentioned earlier Martin's book, The Ring Net Fisherman. This is the opening paragraph of the conclusion. "The journey from Glasgow to my home in Campbelltown, along the road that loops the bays of the western shore of Lough Fyne, unfailingly saddens me, as though I were travelling through a country peopled by ghosts. Abandoned cottages have succumbed to ruination, or more ignominiously surrendered their history to summer occupants. Fishermen's stores overflow with weeds and litter, the stumps of net poles standing rotting in the ebb. The croftlands, for centuries tilled and harvested, have reverted to wildness. And with all that unhuman dissolution has receded the Gaelic people and their language, an unreturning tide." So that sense of the visual in Martin's expression, the road that loops the bays of the western shore, the cottages, stores, stumps of net poles, is strongly evident here in this melancholic meditation on the demise of the ring net. This sense of the visual pervades all of Martin's subsequent work, and it is almost as though he goes back to the word image concerns of the ring net, whether in his other books on herring fishing, his historical essays on Kintyre, his essays and occasional pieces on summer wanderings, his collections of dialect words from Campbelltown, Carradale or Tarbert, or his collections of poems. He seems always to be very concerned to make the word into image and thereby achieve a certain thingness, very much akin to the notion propounded by Williams, the modernist poet, no ideas but in things. When we turn to Maclean, we find the counterpoint. He is searching always for the resonance of the word, speaking in conversation of the influence of Sorley Maclean's poem Halig upon his work. He says, quote, "Here was a blueprint, a visual essay encompassing aspects of tradition, narrative, surrealism, and the vernacular." When he makes a list of the seminal influences upon his work, he begins not with artists, but with folklorists. The particular ways that these word-image confluences continue to resurface in the works of the Maclean and Martin throughout the years is far too large a subject for this paper, but I will focus here on one recent publication, a collaboration between Maclean and Martin, again on the ring net, One Time in the Tale of the Herring. So this collaboration combines ringnet ink drawings alongside a collection of Martin's ringnet poems. Today the Sea, one of the fascinating aspects of the poems and the drawings is a crossover at points between the tactile and the aural aspects of the images and the visual or thingly aspects of the words. Martin's poems operate most successfully in the concrete, in the particular, and although there were a number of moments of genuine illumination when he strikes upon an image which stirs a symbolic echo, the image has to be seen as thing first before it becomes a sign, mythic or otherwise. If you do not see the whiskey gilded table in sea stories, or the scales stuck to doorknobs, sea boots, oilskins, plates and mugs, wood-handled knives in herring scales, then you're hardly reading the poems at all. It is this very strong sense of an embodied reality which is sought in both poem and ink drawing, in these word-image collaborations. It is perhaps through the strongly gestural element in Maclean's drawings, with the distinctive visual thingly aspect of the poems, that a kind of multi-dimensionality is best seen. Martin expresses his thoughts in a distinctive diction, which is essentially of the folk. That is, it works most effectively when it is free of abstractions, when the words themselves are mainly single syllable, and when he works mainly with nouns rather than with adverbs or adjectives. This gives the language elements of the visual, the oral and the tangible. It is from boats, hooks, nets, masts, scales, tables, herrings, tides, knives, reefs, lamps, shores, skiffs, pipes, that his poetry is made. In Maclean's drawings, we find that it is in the allowing of the blotting and the scraping away and the thicker, blotchier lines to remain amongst the defter touches that a particular modulation is achieved. It is almost as though the nouns of Martin's are become unadorned forms within Maclean drawings. Any over-refinement would suggest the adjective or the adverb. In the most successful drawings, we hear the sounds of the sea, of the waves breaking against the prow of the boat, the feel of the net, the pounding of waters, and we feel also like a shiver, something of the dangers. The figures are in darkness, often alone, on the edge, with only a fragile bow shape against an immense sea. Maclean's handwritten versions of the poems are set against the drawings, and the loosely woven handwriting enhances the rhythms within Martin's lines, frees them from the constraints of typeface. I want to look at one of Martin's poems, which has become part of a contemporary idiom. The Scottish traditional folk revival has been through a remarkable second phase in recent years, and this is a musical interpretation of one of Martin's poems, The Herd's Hoose. The poem begins, Your nicht, sleeved wie a sleever, rowling round the cock, her 4-foot fawn canny, buffin seas to smock.
Rowling round the cock, her 4-foot fawn canny, buffin seas to smoke. I saw a licht in the herd's hoose, come winking through the murk, and thought to him and his tappy dogs chuckled fae their work.
The elements of the ballad are there. The narrative, the focus on detail, the rhyme in the second and fourth lines, the strong sense of voice, but most of all what Yeats would refer to as an echo of the regularized rhythm of the folk song behind a more natural conversational idiom. The words themselves are distinctive, The sibilants, plosives, and fricatives of the Scots are used to dynamic effect when combined with carefully chosen assonantal echoes to drive the poem forward. And yet, for all the artistry of the arrangement, these are the words of the folk. Martin's collection of words from Tarbert, Carradale, and Campbelltown are not just of academic interest. They represent a living idiom. They're collected from informants and the locations themselves, bearing witness to colloquial linguistic forms, amalgamating Gaelic, Scots, and English. The word Grisha in the third verse of the poem The Herd's Hoose derives from the Gaelic Griasoch, a fire of embers. Finally, returning to the theme of resistance to the narrow ascendant canon, it is not just that unorthodox word-image combinations threaten the terms of genre continuity. They represent something of what Frederick Jameson would call a utopian impulse. Jameson makes certain slightly cryptic comments on the role of folk forms, seeing them as easily commodified within a pluralistic culture of postmodernism. That is, unless they be seen as representative of a different vision, which defies the status quo. This radical impulse is seen here in the foregrounding of the voices of the fishermen, the rapt attention to the boats and gear and lore connected to a way of life, and in the way that the forms of representation themselves seem to be breaking apart as word seeks the image and the image seeks the voice in order to try and do some kind of justice to the subject. It is there in the way that the folk subject threatens the domain of high art. It is a questioning of narrow ascendant forms and canons and traditions. It asks searching questions, not just about what culture is, but of the role that culture must play in enabling us to see reality at all. It asks, do we wish to have our understanding of the world framed for us in some kind of narrow elite form, sponsored by the cultural corridors of power? Do we not, in fact, deserve to see representations of the world which enable us to experience the sense of a multi-dimensional reality? Thanks so much.
Thank you, Lindsay. That was great. Wonderful images there. Should we go straight? I'm just conscious of time. So if you want to show your film, should we just go straight into that?
Joe, can you upload that? We'll just watch a few minutes while Joe is uploading that. It's a few minutes of
Father had before the Margarita BA117 was built. This photograph would be taken about 1925, 1926. Round about 1925 anyway. That's my father at the tiller there. From left to right, my brother Roy standing forward there. Brother Marshy standing on top of the hatch. And my brother Turner just past my father there. That was John Turner, my Crindle, my father. He was well known as Geely Johnny throughout the fishing community. And that is my brother Willie holding onto the rope on the pier. This boat had a 1520 petrol paraffin Kelvin. And the boat you see out there at her anchor is the Ocean Bride. That was my father's brother, my uncle, Tom, Uncle Tom they called him. That was his boat. That was the boat my father had before the Margarita BA117. I think they're either going out to the drift net or to the screens. This was the kind of last boat that the wives had any participation in the fishing. It's Madonna, Calvin Hughes, MS-24. That was the favourite fish sounder at that time, bottom sounder. That was just after that would be about 2 years before that it was introduced to the fleet. Previous to that it was just the sealing wire and burning in the water, the phosphorus in the water during the summer and during the night, there the end away and the net going out, shooting the net. That's bows, as we called them, the floats. They're made of, at that time, they're made of canvas and filled with Archangel tire to seal them. You blew them up and put a plug in. Nowadays it's all plastic. That was the only time there's anybody drowned or hurt at the fishing really. The shooting the gear and the bow caught them in the ears and put them over the side. One chap was drowned a case like that, and another one, he was lucky, he went down into the water from the bow and pulled himself up with the net and they got to the bow and put his legs round about it and his arms round about it and he sat like that to the whole back the gear and got him.
Okay, thank you. That was really, it's wonderful to hear those voices, isn't it? Have we got any questions? Has anybody got any questions? They can either put them in the chat and or you can ask Jack and Lindsay directly your questions.
There's a couple in the chat from.
Oh, have I missed them?
Like they're kind of like similar and they're just about methodology, really.
Okay, yes, no, I can see that one about about your methodology, Jack. Do you want to speak a little bit about that?
Yes, thank you. And also thank you, Lindsay, for that presentation. So yeah, to kind of bridge the two questions together, a big part of what I was about in my research was phenomenology. So I'm big into text-based research. You know, I love to read all sorts of things. I even like, I'm still learning, but I'm really bad at it. But I've been trying to learn Russian language so I can read more primary sources. But what I do is I like to rely on a sort of ambitious mix of secondary sort of analysis, Russian writers and Western writers, of course. And so I like to do text, but for me, what was really important was I had to go to this place and I had to actually document it myself physically. So I worked all summer and then spent all that money in going up to Svalbard myself. Before I even knew we were able to do the masters, I just thought, you know, I'm just gonna go. And yep, that's what it was. I just went there and got a guide, got a little trip out to Pyramiden myself, and just documented the settlement, took loads of photos. I made friends with a photographer there who was also taking some photographs. So in the thesis, it's like a combination between myself and Goncarlo Pacheco, who's a Portuguese architect and photographer, the guy I made friends with there. And that was great. So phenomenologically speaking, really important to be there in Pyramiden to feel the severity of the cold in Svalbard, which is very cold. Even though I went in pretty mild October, it was still very, very cold. And I think you needed to know. And also there was little details that hadn't even occurred to me about like the guns they have, like the rifles that they have at Pyramiden are very old Mauser rifles that have very fine and intricate detail in regards to loading the bullet into the gun to load it back and fire, and your hands get so cold that they start to get it's very difficult to do that. So just a little detail like that is something so important that you had to actually be there to understand. And then in terms of photography, place-based research, so yeah, phenomenologically speaking, going to the place, so important, because how am I going to write about this place if I don't know the feelings that these characters are feeling, if I haven't felt some of it? And then, of course, it's sometimes as the play goes on, it gets less about the particular place and more about the internal feeling of nostalgia and the internal feeling of grief and loss and all those things, which we've all felt. So we all understand. But that very basically, yes, place was important. Photography was important. And I think also photography is important in writing any thesis for me, because I think the visual stimulation for the marker, very important. You need to keep their attention, otherwise they'll nod off. Yeah, so that's it very quickly, I guess. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Jack. No, that was a very full response. Anne has put a sort of lengthy question comment in the chat. I don't know if you can see that, Lindsay. Talking about themes of democracy and thinking about the wider context of the time, i.e. the School of Scottish Studies and things. So do you want to respond to that?
Yes, absolutely. But I'll maybe first of all have a quick response to Dan's comment about photography and place-based research, which I wasn't really sure was perhaps directed to me or both of us, indeed. And definitely photography and place-based research is incredibly important in my own research. I've written a paper on Tarbert Loch Fyne, just one small place, a fishing village, which you saw some images of by A.B. Ovenston, and looking at that place and representations of that place by a photographer and also by a novelist, a novel called Gillespie, written by MacDougall Hay. And that was a really interesting piece of research to look at it from the perspective of two different forms of representation at a particular time. In terms of Anne's comment, sorry, let me just pull that up. Yes, she's talking about, yes, democracy and the wider context of the time. Yes, I referenced very much the folk. But I did think it was very interesting that at the time that Maclean had his exhibition, which was about the industry, and the communication and the letters between Maclean and Martin emphasises very much that their concerns were absolutely about the industry and the accuracy in all aspects of that industry. And at that same time, actually, was when all the newspapers were raging about the bricks in the Tate, which I thought was in a way still about the artist and his ego. And Maclean's work was not at all about that. And I thought much more ahead of its time, much more revolutionary, if you like, than the bricks in the Tate. I thought it was a very interesting period. And you're referencing some other artists like David Harding, etc., from that period. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Lindsay. Just to chip in from me, I was really interested in what you were saying about the poetry of things, and embodied reality. And actually, having read Mike's paper this morning, I felt there were huge connections between what the two of you were saying, about how it's really important to get the details right. And it's the relationship, isn't it, between the human and the inhuman that came through. I suppose a final comment from me, I just loved the voices, that really strong sense of storytelling. There's a narrative, I felt like we should have been almost sitting by a crackling fire, listening to these tales being told. So that was a performative aspect as well. So I think we are coming up to time now, and I would just like to thank two wonderful speakers for really, really inspiring talks, both visually inspiring, and also sparking off lots of kind of abstract concepts about, you know, phenomenology and research and how we do research as well, which is really, really interesting. So thank you very much. And I think I have to hand over to Alex South. Alex, are you here?
Yes, I am. Hopefully you can see and hear me.
Hi, Alex.
Hi,
that's great. Well, I'm gonna shoot off and hand over to you. So thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm very happy to be here to introduce the next presentation, which is pre-recorded. It combines performances and discussion. My name is Alex South. I'm a performing musician, currently doing an interdisciplinary PhD on the rhythms of humpback whale song and how these relate to the rhythms in human musics. Also on the panel, as you'll see, are composer and musicologist Emily Doolittle, viola player Katherine Wren, and poet Lesley Harrison. Emily is one of my PhD supervisors and is based at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. Katherine is a member of the Royal Scottish National Orchestra and leads a project called Nordic Viola. And Lesley is a well-published poet who lives on the Angus coast. To borrow the title of one of the sessions from this morning, we're all connected by the sea, with shared interests in the human and more than human cultures living above and below its surface. So I'm now going to play the presentation. I'll stream it stream the video from my computer, but I'll also put a YouTube link up in the chat so that if anybody has any problems with that the streaming, you can go over to YouTube. It lasts about 55 minutes, and I'll be here at the end to, and I'd love to hear your comments and any and questions you may have. And I'm also hoping that possibly Lesley will join me for that. Okay, so I will now share my screen. Okay, actually, let's just check that I got the sound shared. Just do that once again. Okay, it should work this time. Okay, so I'll rejoin you in about 55 minutes.
This is an erasure poem, which means you start with a text and you delete and delete and delete until you're left with an arrangement of words on the page, a form that suits your meaning, and also
Alex, we've lost sight. Sorry, it's fine.
These bulks, the longest, the middling, to follow of themselves, of arcs of single following, as another one another arcs.
So Social Sounds from Wales at Night is for solo voice or instrument and tape, and it's based almost entirely on the song of a single humpback whale, which was shared with me by Patrick Miller, who's a biologist at St. Andrews University. Humpback whale songs can sound a lot like human music in terms of timbre, melody, use of pattern and repetition, and so on. So the center of this piece is actually the human singer or instrumentalist playing an unaltered transcription of this humpback whale song. The tape part, which accompanies the whale song, is made out of the same song, as well as some gray seal, sperm whale, and musician wren songs, which were provided by Thomas Getz, Luke Rendell, and Henrik Brum, respectively. But these songs are also highly processed using a program called Soundhack and Audacity that at first you can't recognize any animal songs within this accompanimental tape part. But gradually, the recording of the humpback whale itself emerges from the tape part and starts to play in duet with the human soloist. The human soloist then goes off into an improvisatory section, which is based on the humpback whale's song style. And one of the things I've really enjoyed about having this piece be for any voice type or any instrument is that each person, you know, partly depending on the instrument and partly depending on their personality as a musician, will pick up on different aspects of the whale song for their improvisation. And I feel like every musician I've worked with has somehow, their improvisation has sounded true to the whale song, but they've also all sounded very different. Whether they're exploring the timbre of the song, the musical gestures, the expressiveness, or the structure. So I wanted to ask both Alex South and Katherine Wren, who performed this piece. And I first wanted to ask Katherine Wren a little bit about what she was thinking about when she played the improvisatory section of this piece.
Yeah, one of the most moving things for me, I think, about doing social sounds was really the act of feeling like you were duetting with the whale. And I guess going into the improvisatory section, I was picking up on some of the sounds that the whale had made and extending those, and I suppose instrumentalizing those sounds and suiting those to my own instruments. So it was my reaction to the sounds that the animal made, and extending those into my own instrument, and I suppose drawing out the character of my instrument. I mean, I'd agree with Emily that each instrument that plays that music brings some of its own character into it. And I think as a viola player, I kind of feel that I have a very singing instrument, and an instrument with a really wide range of timbres, and actually that can make noises very similar to the humpback whale. So yeah, that was my kind of main goal in playing that music, I think.
Great, thanks. And what were you thinking about, Alex?
It's been quite a while since I recorded the piece, but as I recall, I was first of all started out by actually building on the percussion, and I mean the percussion is something unusual for me to do, and I found that there were particular pictures within the percussion that worked really well with the sound on the track. So I think my improvisation started out from that, actually kind of with percussion and then imitating the percussion on the clarinet, and then also getting into the humpback whale melody, as Katherine was mentioning, and playing it in different ways and exploring different timbral possibilities. I think I was singing alongside with playing at one point, and finally also there's towards the end of the improvisation, there's a part where there's some ascending sounds in the processed electronic track, and that also became part of the general movement of the improvisation, just a kind of growing excitement and getting higher and higher on the clarinet.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I didn't mention in my introduction to the piece, but there's also a sort of a fairly minimal percussion part, which is usually played by the singer or instrumentalist, and it starts out with something making ocean sounds, often an ocean drum or a rain stick or something like that, which accompanies the whale song. So now we're going to hear Alex performing this piece.
Electra perivalaris, geese flying over my head and then into the distance, was inspired by the composer's visits to Caer Laverock in Dumfriesshire. During the winter months, the entire population of barnacle geese from Svalbard migrate to this part of Scotland. Electra spent whole days in the presence of these geese, watching them on the ground and in the sky, and recording the sounds that they make. On one occasion, as she was leaving, she noticed a distant shape in the sky. It came closer and closer until the sky above her was filled with geese, and all she could hear was their voices. After they passed over her, they flew away into the distance. The piece is scored for live viola and electronics, and it consists of modified recordings of the birds and of their surroundings, so water and air noises, the sound of the sea on the estuary. And to begin with, the viola produces textural sounds. It uses a technique called circular bowing, where the bow literally moves in circles on the string, which actually makes a kind of more, I suppose, a less focused, more airy sound, which complements the sound of the geese. And then as the music develops, there's a soaring melody that evolves in the solo viola, which to me at any rate is suggestive of flight and the spaciousness of the surroundings. The piece really resonates with me because I spent some time out in Iceland camping by Lagerfjord, which is a huge lake near Eilsdalur in East Iceland. And at that time, the geese were gathering to migrate south. And simultaneously, I was preparing to fly back to Scotland after I'd been resident in Iceland and the Faroe Islands for a month. And yeah, it was a time where I was kind of ready to travel home again. And I kind of felt a sense of kinship with these geese because we were making the same journey south. I live in an area near to Stirling where the geese collect in the fields. So it's always a big event when they fly over us and start taking up their winter residency here. So it was quite something actually just to reflect on both the geese and myself making the journey, myself obviously by mechanized means flying, and just thinking about what that meant, that the birds were actually doing this long journey under their own power.
So one thing that struck me when I listened to the performance, Katherine, was that the geese sounds are used very differently by Electra to the way in which Emily uses the whale sounds, etc., for social sounds. And I was wondering whether you felt differently about learning and performing the piece, given that the sounds, there's much less imitation or kind of obvious imitation of geese sounds. So that I was wondering whether that made a difference to you. Also, whether how it feels to be preparing a piece which is based on animal sounds when it's less clear, you know.
Yeah, I would say learning geese flying was a very different experience to playing social sounds. I think with social sounds, I kind of felt almost like I was in the water, if you like, with the whales, and very much duetting with the whale and trying to blend my sound with the whale sound. Where in geese flying, yeah, definitely my world as a performer, as a viola player, was separate to the geese. I guess at the beginning, actually, with the circular bowing sounds, I kind of felt more integrated into the surrounds there. To me, that kind of feels a bit like the beating of the wings, and you know, maybe feeling myself more in their world. But as the melody evolves, very much feeling like an observer to that scene, very much a human participant, separate from the birds. I suppose exactly what Electra has in the title, the idea of the geese flying over my head. I mean, I kind of picture that scene as I'm playing, that you know, there's a bit at the climax of the piece where the birds take off, this huge beating of wings. So it's almost like a mental reflection of what they're doing, that idea of the music soaring and the birds taking off. And I suppose the world's almost diverging, actually. So, you know, I'm this melodic element reflecting on what they're doing, as opposed to trying to imitate and be part of their world. So, yeah, it's a very different piece to perform.
It seems to me to be some way in which there's also almost a synesthesia going on between the flight, you know, watching the flight and the movement and the you know, lifting up and just being free from gravity, so to speak, and the melody. You know, and I was thinking of the ways that music can work in different ways. So it doesn't have to be. Obviously, if you're not imitating sounds, then there are other ways to create correspondences between animals and the music. And I was, for me, there was something, yeah, sort of transference that way. I don't know whether that speaks to how you experience that melody.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I mean, it's quite a high melody on the instrument. There's very few low pitches used in it, actually, and I think the viola in that register has a very distinct timbre. It's quite a kind of melancholy sound, and yeah, definitely that feeling of lightness and airiness that I guess kind of conveys the freedom of flight a little bit as well. So yeah, there's definitely some thought into how that melody evolves and how it reflects the animal world, I think, in that.
I just think that's so interesting, the fact that the viola changes personality or, you know, empathetic qualities as it, you know, moves through different registers. I think that's such an interesting idea. You talked about having a melancholy in the high pitches. Yeah, I wonder how much of that is I don't know, would that be because we does it become more human, or does it become closer to a human voice, or why do you think that is? Maybe it's because it moves away from something that sounds almost human.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I think string instruments generally have a very human quality, their ability to sing, and yet at the same time, we obviously don't need to breathe, which, you know, is a very unhuman thing, I suppose, that we can spin these long lines. I think part of it is just an instrumental thing, and just the acoustics of that particular instrument, that each string takes on a different character. But I mean, it's an interesting subject, actually, because I wrote a piece myself based on Lagerfjord, the same area that I heard the geese at and saw the geese at. And interestingly enough, I actually tuned the instrument down in that. So I'm really focusing on low textures. Again, using electronics, actually, in that one. Recording myself and then manipulating that sound, and you know, it's much darker texture. So yeah, I don't know whether there's that feeling of that, you know, that music's much more grounded. And I mean, actually listening to a lot of Icelandic music, there is a lot of darkness in the colouring quite often. So I do think there's parallels between the kind of timbres you get and the landscapes and the you know, and nature actually, and the way we depict that in music. I think there definitely is a connection. I mean, I don't know whether Alex feels something similar on the clarinet. I'm not sure.
I mean, there's certainly different feelings which are easier to evoke, I think, in different parts of the range of the clarinet. And I suppose the clarinet has a very similar range to the viola, really. Yeah, and in social sound, certainly, I explore the full range of the instruments. Partly that's just to do with what pictures are around in like written pictures in the score, but also in the improvisatory section, there's this kind of I felt this impulse to just get higher and higher to kind of escape somehow.
Yeah, I think both viola and clarinet, you know, humpback whales also have a very wide range. So I think viola and clarinet are both quite well suited to playing that piece. I know, you know, for example, I've had it played on double bass, which I guess also can go very high, but it doesn't really naturally gravitate towards going up high. And definitely the lower instruments or higher instruments that have played it sort of bring out very different aspects of the song than something that can encompass sort of both ends of it.
Yeah, I think that's something that people are often surprised at, actually, the humpback whale, how high it can sing. You know, people think it's a large animal. It should have a really low voice, and it can sing very low. But it all, as you say, Emily, it can go right up to the very high and top notes on the grand piano and beyond.
Right, which I guess is actually similar to a lot of instruments, like you know, bass clarinet or bass or any of this. I mean, the stringed instruments can keep going up higher, but if you have a high instrument, there, in most cases, there's no way to make it go lower. There are some, you know, sometimes there's very extended techniques which can make an instrument play lower than you might expect, but for the most part, it is the larger ones that have that extended range.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, go on.
So no, I was going to say I do think there's an analogy between freedom and pitch rising, isn't there? There just seems to be that idea of a melody taking flight, and you know, just that sense of space you get with the higher pitches.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, just because in so many cases there is not an absolute limit. You could just go that tiny bit higher, whereas with the low note there usually is at some point an absolute limit.
Yeah.
There's something that Roger Payne says about humpback whales, and Roger Payne recorded some of the first humpback whale song that became well known in the West in the 1970s, and he talks about the voice being ethereal and unearthly, which sort of does put it into those realms. I mean, the sounds that he was recording were predominantly high sounds, or contained a large number of those high expressive sounds, or sounds which we hear as expressive. But I don't know. I'm not sure whether I describe them as ethereal. But maybe that goes with freedom. I'm not sure. So the audio part to Cetacea is an unedited improvisation that Katherine and I recorded during 2020. We'd previously talked with Lesley about our overlapping interests in animal song and the cultures of the North Atlantic, and had read her poem Cetacea, itself inspired by an exhibition by artist Marina Rees, centered on the bones of the deep diving pilot whale. We both found much in it to motivate us musically, beginning with the lines unpitched, long low tones degraded by the air. Katherine and I independently chose a few lines from the poem and decided without much discussion to start out with the pitches A, C and E, selected from the title of the poem. Nothing else was set. We improvised once, realised we had something quite promising, and played again, recording this second session. By sheer coincidence, our recording is the same length as the longest recorded dive of a long-finned pilot whale. The next step in creating the video piece was the finding of the film My Pilot, Whale, from filmmakers Alexander and Nicole Gratovsky, which had been put up on YouTube with a Creative Commons license. I'd not previously done much video editing, but the astonishing footage of pilot whales shot from close range drew me in, and once I'd done the preparatory work of choosing sequences, the piece felt like it really made itself very quickly. I made one use of one particular effect that appeared to render the whales almost transparent, but otherwise did very little to the clips, other than to assemble them in a way that fitted both the music and a loose narrative structure that took us from the surface down into the depths. The lines from Lesley's poem were introduced at the moments when they instigated musical responses, and we decided to add an audio recording of the pilot whales themselves at the start of the piece, and this was supplied by biologist Michael Shear. So this might be a good point to tell you a little more about pilot whales. They are highly social animals living in stable family groups of around a dozen closely related individuals. Recent research by Amy Van Sees and colleagues has begun to confirm what has been long suspected, that social units possess their own dialects of calls that may serve to maintain segregation among different groups. If, as it seems likely, such dialects are passed on by social learning, this means that pilot whales can join a number of other cetaceans that have been described by biologists as possessing a culture, community-wide behaviours that are learnt by one animal from another. was just wanting to know a little bit more about the practicalities of writing the poem, and were you at in the museum with the bones of the pilot whale in the installation, or how did it all come about?
Oh, I had a writing residency up in the north of Iceland at Skagastrand, and it was in December 2016. And I went round to Husavik on the bus to the Whale Museum, and there was hardly anybody there because it was December, and I had the place to myself for 2 afternoons, and there was just myself and all these beautiful, beautiful reconstructions of whale skeletons that they had suspended from the ceiling, and they had lit from the bottom, and you walked through them through the museum, which was astonishing. And at the same time, in part of the museum, they had Marina Reese's exhibition there, and the sound that she had as part of her exhibition, it echoed through the building as well. And it was an otherworldly experience altogether, but it really it made me think very much about how what we can say about these things is only a tiny, tiny, tiny fragment of what there is to be said, and how incomplete our language is. So when I went to, when I was reading, they had a lovely library there, and when I was reading through text on this, I thought the only way really to, I'm not the person to invent this idea, I have to say, but the only way to talk about this is to not talk about it in a sense. You can point with language, but language is so inadequate to the experience that another species might have of their world and how they express themselves. It's a foolish, vain thing to do, to think that you can encapsulate that in sentences. And so that was why I used phrases from the things that I read, but I broke them up just to indicate that the gaps are at least as important, or more important possibly, than the tiny fragments you retain. So, and that also mirrored these whales being suspended from the ceiling of this old whaling shed, which was now the museum, in darkness. So.
One of the things that's really, apparent both in hearing the piece, but especially in hearing sort of your introduction to it, Alex, is just thinking about how sort of interdisciplinary and collaborative that single, now it's a single piece that, somebody could watch it, but yet there's two musicians, a poet, the artist, the filmmakers, the scientific research, and the whales themselves that are part of it. And I think you could say that you're all, in a sense, equally collaborators in creating this piece. Like the piece would not exist, or at least it would not exist as it is without any one of those parts, and many other parts as well. But that sort of brings me to the question, which I know I've thought about in my own music, which often is based on animal songs, and I know Alex thinks about as well. But just the question of what does it mean to have another species as a collaborator in your piece? Because obviously, if I'm working with the three of you, we can talk about what we're doing and, how we want our music to be used, or what sounds right, or what we want to do together. But with the whale, we have the music. In some cases, we have the skeletons or the videos or whatever. We have the sounds, but we can't ask the whale what it thinks about this collaboration. So I'm wondering if any of you have any thoughts on that. And this is not a trick question. I don't have an answer. It's something I think a lot, but I want to know other people's thoughts.
I think it's very important to be respectful to the animal, first and foremost. I mean, as you say, we can't know what the thought processes of that animal are as it's making those sounds. We have no way of knowing what it would think, I suppose, of us doing that. And I think for me, it's not trying to be the whale. It's sure I might mimic the sound of the whale, but yeah, it's hard to explain. But it's wanting to be close to that animal and wanting to understand the sounds it makes, while still being respectful of the fact that it has its own world and it has its own language that I can never know either. But yeah, I suppose to bring that out into the world and to make something beautiful of it, and to integrate it into something human that hopefully other people can relate to, that might then make them interested in that animal and in its world. And I think a lot of the importance for me behind a lot of the art that I do, environmental art that I do, is to make people aware of the beauty, I think, actually, of these creatures and these landscapes, and to therefore consider them and to respect them, and by so doing to treat them better. I don't know whether that's idealistic, but you know, I mean, I think art that agonizes over what mankind's doing to the world has a role too. But I think equally, to avoid alienating people sometimes, or making that too big a thing, you know, almost a despairing thing of, you know, what can we do about it? There's nothing we can do about it. Instead of to turn that on its head and to make people think that, look, this is something really special. These are special creatures with, you know, they're sentient beings, and you know, to really connect with that and to want to preserve the places they are, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I had a thought there when you started, Katherine, talking about ethics and or feeling respectful towards the animals. And this chimes with some reading I've been doing recently from Donna Haraway, and she talks about responsibility, but as responsibility. So the way that works of art can help us to respond, to give us the ability to respond to the kind of some of the awful things that are happening in the world today. And I think, you know, as artists and musicians, we can do that, and it helps us somehow reach out to other people, as you said as well. You know, it's not only about the way that playing pieces based on animal song or making pieces based on animal song helps us as musicians or poets or composers to get in touch with the animal somehow, to form some kind of relation. It's also to act in some sort of mediating role with other people, and I think that's really important.
I think you can also use your art, whether it's language through poetry or any form of writing, or through music or anything at all. You can also use it to point to what's not there. You know, you can use the conventions and the habits and the structures that are well rehearsed and well practiced within your own art medium to, you can use them disruptively to point to, you know, what is beyond framing. And although it's very easy to say, to take an ethical stance and say these are precious, these are beautiful, you can also take that stance through your art and say these are just inexplicable, and these are just unwordable, and these are just, you know, so strange and other to our experience. And that is what you need to be in awe of, and to be respectful towards the fact that, you know, it's a failure of imagination and a very conceited thing to think you can quantify and describe and explain, when, you know, so much of you know, what is there that you're responding to as a human being, you know, so much of the elements that you're grasping, you might be entirely misinterpreting, or they're valuable to you or meaningful to you because they chime with something within your human imagination, but there's so much beyond that. Perhaps the only way to point to that in a very inefficient way is just to disrupt language, or to use disruptive or unexpected conventions in music.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I feel like something that's coming through a little bit in what both of you said, Lesley and Katherine, like just that to sort of understand another species, or to come closer to understanding them, you have to make lots of room for the things you don't understand. Like if you think you can totally understand what they're thinking or feeling or doing, then you're clearly misunderstanding it. And it's only when you leave a lot of space for mystery that you can maybe have more of a glimpse of what it might be like to be them.
Woe as in wound, ha as in hunt, ah as in raft, ill as in full, as in breach. Woo, as in fluke. Ha, as in tongue. Ah, as in abe. As in oil. As in jaw. Woo, as in run. Ha, as in calf. Ah, as in eye. As in blow. As in breath. Woo, as in bow. Ha, as in tump. Ah, as in slight. As in blink. As in swell. Woo, as in sound. Ha, as in hull. Ah, as in wash. As in shelve. Hey, as in dive.
Okay, so I hope some of you are still here. It's really nice to read the comments that come up in the chat. And if anybody has any more direct questions, then please either type them in the chat or unmute yourself and speak. Otherwise, I could respond to one or two of the comments. Maybe I'll start just by, there was a comment near the beginning about the kind of mimetic quality that, or an allusion to that. So Holly says she would never have thought that the clarinet could sound like a whale, and it's so complimentary to their song though. This is just brought up a raft of issues about instrumental mimesis and what happens when you're listening to another animal in this case, and you use your instrument or your voice to imitate in some way. And I think for me, it's always more than just mimicry, or rather, it's not just about trying to achieve a copy of the sounds that and it can't just be that. It's more about trying to incorporate what the sounds you're hearing and focus them into your instrumental language. There's a translation, in other words, going on of some kind, and I think that issue of translation is a really interesting one. And there's also was an interesting comment just about the notation, about how it resembled whales breaching, and I don't know whether that was deliberate on Emily Doolittle's part. I suspect it's a kind of nice accident, but there's also, to me, an interesting parallel, because in fact Adorno had a theory that the music notation, Western classical notation that is, originated out of an imitation of the precentor's hand. So in from many of you will know this, but Western classical notation comes out of the notation that was used for Gregorian chants, and that was conducted in a very fluid, gestural way to show the shapes of the pictures. And yeah, so Adorno had this theory that there was imitation there going on just in the notation, in creating the notation. Yeah, so there's lots of mirrors reflecting mirrors, I think, in different senses, different modes. So yeah, I think we've probably run out of time, but yeah, it's been I've had a great day listening to talks, and I'll hand over to the conference organisers.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex and colleagues, for a very stimulating talk. They're a very good way to conclude the first day, I think, of our discussions. So I think you'll all agree that we've had a very stimulating and intellectually diverse experience and exchange of ideas on this, the first day. I've had this sense of a journey today. We've moved from the Antarctic to Rapa Nui, the Western Isles, other parts of Scotland, and then in the arts, this notion of linear continuity and discontinuity in the visual arts, post-Soviet Arctic, and then as we finished up today with the musicality of animal communication. So I'd like to thank all the speakers and contributors. I'd like to thank all the chairs who ably chaired the sessions today. The technical support, Rory and Leanne kept everything going very smoothly today. And I'd like to thank also the Vice Chancellor for his encouraging words at the start and for opening our discussions. So if we can conclude like that for today, thanks again to everybody. And I look forward to seeing you all in the morning for Margaret Bennett's keynote address starting at 9:15 in the morning. So I'll say goodbye and see you all again tomorrow. Thank you very much.